In recent weeks, the French government has come under fire over increases in living costs. Hundreds of thousands of protesters, calling themselves the Yellow Vests, have taken to the streets of the capital, sometimes resulting in violence and destruction. And even though the government has agreed to raise wages and reduce various taxes, the unrest has largely persisted, with implications for the presidency of Macron. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Since taking office in May 2017, Macron implemented numerous reforms to make the French economy more competitive. His cabinet cut corporate taxes, reduced public spending, and eased taxes on the wealthy. However, Macron's reforms also reduced the purchasing power of the poor while increasing that of the rich. At a time when populist nationalism is sweeping across Europe, Macron's pro-business attitude backfired. His approval ratings dropped among the youth and the urban class, while vocal disapproval surged in the French countryside, where living costs have steadily increased. As such, critics claim that Macron is the unapologetic president of the rich, and that he lacks the approval of ordinary people. Upset with the high costs of gasoline and fuel, an entrepreneur in online cosmetics posted a petition on Facebook calling on the French government to reduce prices at gas stations. Initially, the article went unnoticed, but when the government announced a tax increase on gasoline and diesel to reduce greenhouse emissions, the petition picked up steam and gathered nearly 1 million signatures. Soon afterwards, the protesters donned yellow safety vests, which all French drivers are required to carry in their cars, and moved to the streets where they rallied against the government. Since these safety vests are meant to be used in emergencies, they also symbolically hinted the dire living conditions of the protesters. As the Yellow Vest movement evolved from opposition to rising fuel taxes into wider demand to improve purchasing power of middle-class families, the movement absorbed other groups with social, political, and economic grievances. Then, in mid-November, the situation erupted. On 4 successive Saturdays, large crowds clashed with law enforcement agencies. Now, while political protests and grassroots movements are common in France, the intensity of the Yellow Vest movement had not been witnessed in decades. Scenes of shattered stores, blazing vehicles, and projectiles thrown at police were broadcast around the world. At the same time, parts of Paris were shut down. In truth, most of the violence came from the other existing groups that joined the ranks of the Yellow Vests, but the ordeal also illustrates another dynamic of the demonstrations, which is that the movement emerged with no direct links to any political parties, trade unions, or NGOs. Historically, such movements tend to fade away, but they are exceedingly hard to negotiate with because they lack leadership and organization. Some of the demands of the Yellow Vests include reasonable goals, like the abolition of specific taxes. Other pursuits are more radical, such as the resignation of Macron. Either way, political parties from the left and right have tried to coerce the social discontent for their own goals, but thus far, none has succeeded to integrate the Yellow Vests. For now, the only thing we can say with certainty is that the Yellow Vests are united in their disapproval for Macron. For the French president, the situation eventually proved to be too much. On December 10th, for the first time in his presidency, Macron backed down on a policy decision and conceded to the Yellow Vest movement. Among other things, in a televised broadcast, the president apologized and pledged to increase the minimum wage without any cost to employers. He also cancelled plans to increase social charges on pensions for those on less than 2,000 euros a month. Finally, he stated that he would cancel the controversial fuel tax that ignited the Yellow Vest movement in the first place. All in all, it is estimated that these concessions will cost France at least 10 billion euros each year. As part of the Eurozone rules, member states are capped at a 3% budget deficit. France's deficit for 2019 sits at 2.8%, but with the new concessions, it would surge as high as 3.4%. So, to abide by the rules of the European Union, Paris must find areas to compensate for the spending cuts. Yet, regardless of the concessions, most of the Yellow Vest protesters are not convinced, and the demonstrations have largely continued. Moreover, in 2019, the French government plans to implement several other reforms, including measures to restrict family benefits below the inflation rate and procedures to narrow down the criteria for unemployment insurance. Technically, since Macron's party controls the majority in the National Assembly and the French presidency holds strong executive powers, reforms can be passed without the support of other parties. However, in practice, the Yellow Vest movement compels lawmakers in the parliament to be more cautious in their support for Macron, which makes it harder for the president to move forward with his economic reforms. Macron's administration also plans to profoundly amend the French constitution by reducing the number of parliamentarians. His reasoning is that this would allow a more efficient legislative procedure. Yet, unlike the economic reforms, to amend the constitution, Macron will need a majority vote in the Senate, which he lacks and is unlikely to receive from the other political parties. In the past, Macron has hinted to put the constitutional reform to a referendum should the Senate reject it. But such a vote could easily backfire and become a de facto referendum on his own presidency. It is difficult to see how Macron will emerge from this spectacle with his pro-business attitude intact. Altogether, considering the number of controversial reforms planned for next year, social unrest in France is likely to continue. But beyond domestic politics, the leadership in Paris also seeks to reform the European Union by introducing a separate budget for the Eurozone. More specifically, France wants to redesign the European Stability Mechanism into the European Monetary Fund, with powers to assist EU members in financial distress. It's essentially a bailout measure to withstand the next financial crash, and French policymakers have been trying for years to convince their German counterparts to set it up. The Germans have softened their stance, but the reforms require a consensus at the EU level, which will be difficult to achieve since both France and Germany are undergoing domestic political issues. Furthermore, some North European member states of the EU do not see eye to eye with Berlin and Paris. Commonly referred to as the New Hanseatic League or the Bad Weather Coalition, the governments of the Netherlands, Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and the Baltic states vocally oppose increasing financial risk sharing in the Eurozone. The Bad Weather Coalition has informally teamed up with the Eurosceptic government in Italy and is more than capable of opposing the French and German plans for further monetary integration. What makes the French EU reforms even more complicated are the upcoming elections for the European Parliament in May 2019 and the appointment of members to the European Commission and the European Central Bank over the course of next year. These events at the EU level will be a challenge for the ruling parties of Germany and France, with Macron being confronted within and without. Ultimately, the French president may have to abort his reforms for the Eurozone, while at the domestic level, the Yellow Vest movement not only restricts his pro-business agenda, but also signifies that France's established channels of representation are failing to absorb the whole spectrum of social discontent, which is a dangerous trend by itself. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Credit goes to our contributors on Patreon for enabling us to produce content like this. If you want to join our community or learn more about it, visit patreon.com/CaspianReport. In any case, thank you for your patience, and so all.